My name is Luba Bobova. I'm here from Adler University. And I realize I need to work on my title brevity. I'm, following the APA publication manual on making my title maximally descriptive of everything that we're going to cover. But definitely I'm probably winning award for the longest title at NCSPP today. All right, so I have a project that I've been working on at Adler University that is looking at experiences of non-native English-speaking doctoral students in clinical psychology and counseling programs. And we've been doing data collection. It's supported by some internal grant funding from Adler University. We've collected qualitative interviews from faculty and quantitative student survey data. And so I'm going to be sharing some of the results with you. But I want to tell you that it's a passion project for me, in addition to aligning with Adler University mission of social justice and diversifying our field. But also, I'm from Russia, and I am a non-native English speaker myself. I've lived here for a long time now. I went to high school in the U.S., and you may hear I have a very, very faint accent. We're going to get back to that. But certainly, being a non-native English speaker has impacted my graduate training and has impacted my clinical work. And even, to this day, this is something that I continue to encounter as I work with students who are non-native English speakers and as I work with other professionals and, think about how we can diversify our field. So we'll have some great discussion, I hope, a little bit later around all of our experiences with non-native English-speaking trainees. And before we get in any further, I'm also interested in research methodology and assessment. And so one of the things that I wanted to do as I was thinking about preparing this talk for CEs is also show you a little bit about how you can integrate pre-post assessment into measuring change in attitude and behaviors and skills in a workshop like this or in your class. So a little bit of a assignment here to start. Does anybody need paper or pens? Or you can also just do a little mental tally if you're awake enough and your memory is working. So I developed a couple of questions very similar to what the learning objectives for the CE courses are, although this is not exactly corresponding to my learning objectives. This is also just in part for demonstration purposes. And so one of the things that we're going to be talking about today are unique experiences of linguistically diverse students. And I just put a simple 5-point Likert scale here with a couple of anchors. So take a moment to figure out, and this is all, you're not going to share your data with anybody. This is all for the purposes of learning and reflection for you. So just take a moment to think about where you are on the scale right now. And then we're going to do a post-workshop assessment at the end. So my next question is, how deliberate are you in designing your class policies in a way that can promote success of non-native English-speaking students? And if you are not in the business of designing class policies or teaching, you can skip this question. Next question is, how competent do you feel about promoting success of non-native English-speaking students in your doctoral programs? And the final question is, how knowledgeable are you about the impact of colorblindness and multiculturalism attitudes? What impact can these have on your linguistically diverse trainees in your doctoral programs? Okay. So we're going to start with a reflection. And as I mentioned, I'm a non-native English speaker myself. You've heard me talk for a few minutes here now. And I want to ask you to imagine somebody who has a much, much heavier accent. And if you speak other foreign languages, imagine that this person has an accent in a different language that you know, okay? So, like I said, my accent is relatively faint, but a lot of my friends and family have a much thicker accent. So, I'm going to turn up my accent now and speak with a very heavy Russian accent. Imagine if I was speaking to you like this. Imagine now if I was one of your applicants. Now imagine if some grammar was maybe a little bit not correct, and maybe I did not know some words, had a difficult time talking about certain complex topics, maybe had some errors in how I pronounced certain words, but I was very highly motivated to come and help people, and I was ready to talk to you about my other qualifications, and was very enthusiastic student. And I wonder, as you are thinking somebody about with an accent like this during your admissions into your program, I'm going to turn that off now. Think about some of these questions. When you imagine talking to somebody who you maybe have some difficulty understanding, or you notice that they're maybe struggling with expressing themselves, does that raise any concerns about this person's ability to succeed in a doctoral clinical program? Might you have some questions for this applicant that you might not ask of other native English-speaking applicants? What if a person like this approached you, as they're in their program about being their dissertation chair or clinical supervisor? Would you have any reservations about this? Do you have any, maybe you have no reservations and you welcome individuals from all walks of life, but what advice would you want to give these students as they're entering their program or as they're proceeding through the program? And I'm actually not going to ask you to share results of this reflection, but this is some of the situations that we all might encounter at some point or maybe have encountered in the past. And so I want to challenge you if maybe you had a student whose English was like mine, relatively proper with a relatively faint accent, to imagine turning that up. Imagine taking it to a greater extreme. Imagine that this is an international student maybe who is just coming to the US just to enroll in your program, just to study here, and is planning to go back to their country to work as a clinical professional after completing their degree. Okay, so at the start, I want to talk to you a little bit about just some recent research around certain types of biases and assumptions we have. There's a lot of really great research on diversity training, on experimental work around different attitudes that people adopt. And this is a changing time in our society. Some people are holding firm to their beliefs. Other people are very open to expanding their worldview and changing their thinking and their attitudes. So there's lots of very talented people studying this in using different types of methodology. And so I'm going to start with talking to you a little bit about that, and then I'm going to also tell you some results from our research on native English-speaking students, and then we're going to have ample time for discussion for you to really be able to think about how are your class policies or program policies, or even your just communication style, your teaching approach, are they supportive, are they inclusive, and are they sensitive to the unique needs of linguistically diverse students? And I want to start out by saying that we all have biases and assumptions. Me being a non-native speaker from Russia, I have biases about non-native speakers from other programs, right? Or other countries, excuse me. So it's really, and we also know from research that this is just how our brain works, right? We rely on heuristics, whether they're accurate or not. We all use stereotypes because it helps us form categories, and that's how our brain is wired to work. We use generalizations because that helps us communicate certain ideas more briefly, but we also know that there's some pitfalls to that type of thinking, right? So it's really recognizing those types of biases is a way to challenge, overcome them, and also know when they're more likely to come up so you can be more aware of them in the future. So There's lots of great research on just diversity training in general, and the good news is that research shows that it's effective. And the other good news is I'm probably preaching to the choir here a little bit, because research shows that in educational settings this is particularly effective. And in many ways, educational settings like universities, colleges are at the forefront of infusing diversity into the curriculum, providing diversity training for their staff and their faculty, taking an organizational commitment to promoting diversity. This is true for Adler University. It's part of our mission. There's lots of programming that's infused throughout the curriculum, throughout our professional development, to sort of help promote that. And that the more the organizational support there is, the more this isn't just a one-type training, but it's a multimodal, ongoing effort to sort of make people aware of diverse individuals around them, make people give people the tools to better interact with these individuals, give people the tools to detect microaggressions and various types of negative experiences of these individuals. So the more sort of organizational, prolonged, infused efforts there are, the more effective attitude and bias change is in those institutions. And like I said, luckily for all of us, educational settings have much larger effect sizes for these types of outcomes than business settings, and that's where you see the most lasting change in cognition and in attitudes, in behaviors, and in skills of the individuals. But there's also lots of great research that shows that despite all of this, we still have biases that we're unaware of. And there's lots of great tasks like the implicit association task and other types of reflection tasks that are used in diversity training to help people recognize that, recognize their biases. But sometimes when we recognize that we have a bias, we also have an emotional reaction to it. The adaptive emotional reaction is a call to action, is a challenge to want to do something about it. But there is also some research that shows that for some individuals, these emotional reactions, especially when they're kind of negative and are associated with threat or some sort of shame, they can actually lead people to kind of be more set in their more conservative, more biased attitudes. Again, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, and actually some of the research that I read about talks about how some of the sort of negative reactions to diversity training and negative reactions to emotions that people experience when they're notified about biases that they hold tend to occur in individuals who are politically conservative and individuals who are not exposed to other diverse individuals, so individuals who are in sort of homogeneous Caucasian white areas. They tend to feel the most threat and tend to have a more difficult time getting a lot of the benefits out of various types of diversity training initiatives. And recent research tackles specifically two big types of attitudes around diversity training and around sort of experiences of working with minority groups. And one of those is colorblindness. And I'm sure you're all familiar with color blindness, but there's a lot of nuance to sort of, there's some benefits to having a color blindness attitude, and there's also some detriments potentially. So I want to take a moment to make sure we're all aware of this. So on the one hand, the benefit of color blindness is, at its core, it's aimed at promoting equal opportunity, egalitarianism. So it's about treating everybody the same, hopefully treating everybody fairly, and focusing, on a personal level, you focus on our commonalities. So instead of, saying, I'm from this country, I had this experience, I speak this different language, we focus on something like, we all want to help people. We all want to have families. We all want a happy life. We all want a strong economy. We all want, healthy children and promoting safety and good future for our children and developing opportunities, right? And it helps, this kind of sentiment can be very helpful for people coming together. And there's research that shows that color blindness can be very useful at an organizational level when it's coupled with coming together, but then also paying attention to individual and cultural differences. So the color blindness attitude cannot be at the expense of washing out the richness and the diversity of our individual, cultural, and other background experiences. right? Because the flip side, when it does wash away our unique experiences, it can actually make people miss certain elements of discrimination. And we also know that historically, or at organizational and systemic levels, colorblindness attitude actually help preserve the hierarchy, because if you say everybody has to perform at the same level and then certain groups don't perform at that level, you say, well, not my problem, right? We're all supposed to be doing this, and I don't know what it is that led you to not perform at that level, but too bad for you. You know, those of us who can perform are going to be at the top, right? That can be harmful, as we know, because not everybody is coming from the same, quote-unquote, equal playing field, if you will, right? So specifically in academic settings, it could also lead to setting lower expectations for minority students, and sometimes it can make faculty less willing to modify teaching practices if they say, well, you know, everybody has to achieve the same competency at the same rate and at the same level because, you know, I don't see color, and this is kind of my attitude there. And again, kind of can single out students who are not achieving at that level. And of course, if you are in a minority group, that kind of attitude, if you know you're not achieving, if you know you're struggling, if you know you need some additional support, or just if you know you have some unique experiences that you think are helpful for you to bring to your work or to your training program, and those experiences aren't valued or overlooked, that can make you feel marginalized. That can make you feel like the system isn't welcoming to you, right? And people don't want to learn from your unique experiences. You don't have any anything valuable to contribute, you know, given your unique background. So the other prominent attitude is multiculturalism, and it's kind of the opposite at the core, right? Whereas colorblindness sets everybody as equal, multiculturalism takes the opposite approach of really highlighting group and individual differences, and it promotes and celebrates diversity and unique experiences that people from different backgrounds bring to an organization or a training setting. And the benefits of that is it creates an environment where minority group individuals feel welcome and efficacious and valued and heard and appreciated and are free to share, you know, their unique experiences and perspectives. So much more positive environment. And through those kinds of dialogues and through those kinds of interactions, then the dominant group is much more aware of negative experiences of minority groups and are much more readily able to pick up on instances of discrimination or other negative experiences that minority groups might have. But there's also some really interesting research that shows that when you pitch sort of benefits of minority individuals in a setting that's predominantly white or Caucasian, it can actually be perceived as threatening by the majority group. And I think this is something that we've seen in some recent political rhetoric, where in certain places people feel like, oh, you know, my country is not what it used to be. You know, things are being taken away from me because these people are coming and they have different needs and they're going to be taking some of my resources, is the kind of thinking that can result from this type of attitude. And there's some research that shows that how you present multicultural attitude actually has an effect on generating these negative attitudes. So specifically, if you present this very abstractly, like, we all come from families of immigrants, and America has historically been a melting pot, and, you know, some other sort of abstract historical elements in there, then that actually tends to not be particularly threatening. But if you specifically talk about, you know, this is how we're going to potentially see policy affected, this is how we're going to see school programming affected, when you get into the specifics of implementing multicultural attitudes in our society, that's where you see a lot of threatening and a lot of fearful reactions from the majority groups. And then the final kind of a point that I wanted to highlight about this is, again, there's, you know, the country here is still very diverse. Some of us live in very diverse areas, some of us not so much. And I went to school in southern Indiana, where the university itself was relatively diverse, but the area around it, southern Indiana, southern Illinois, Kentucky, not so much. And so while there are some people who are readily adapting multicultural attitudes, with that, in the absence of actual people of color or linguistically diverse people there, it creates stereotypes. So, for example, I have been in many instances myself when I was living in southern Indiana, where people would say, "Oh, it's so great, you're from Russia, we welcome, people from different countries. So you're communist, right?" And like, communism in Russia has not been a thing for many, many years. And of course, I'm not communist. And anyway, so lots of strange kind of stereotypical assumptions around who I am, because I probably was one of the very few people from Europe or from Russia that these individuals have met. Okay, so getting from some more abstract or recent research finding into specifically what we're working with, we all know that APA tells us that we need to recruit and retain diverse students and diverse faculty. And we all have different types of initiatives to do that. And of course, again, depending on geographic location, that can be easier for some of us than for others. I know my graduate program really struggled with that. Not a lot of diverse people want to come to southern Indiana to do their graduate training, but in Chicago, we have much more diverse student body. I know other places like California, New York, this is less of an issue. East, West Coast tends to be also a little bit more diverse, depending on where you are, right? So, and then also there's a great variability in our schools, back to that organizational commitment. Adler University, this is part of our mission, and it's infused through everything. Other big state schools, it's not a clear mission, and it may be more of a mission for a particular department or a particular program, but there may be some difference between how your program's mission and how your program's initiative aligns with the larger organizational mission and what support your program has to really try to implement and be successful in those different initiatives. And where that really boils down to the individual student level is how much infrastructure and support do you have for your international or linguistically diverse students, and aside from sort of university resources such as writing centers, or in some places there's a graduate school that has then an international graduate student organization or other sort of student organizations. Depending on the size of your school, there may be even like specific by country, like Asian student organization and European student organization, African student organization, to cater to sort of specific international students, right? So that might be available at some. But then also, at the individual faculty or program level, what other resources do you have? And if you're a small program and at a program level you don't have a lot of resources, what resources do you have for your faculty who are working with these students? So, and for those of us who are faculty, where do we draw on the skills, on the knowledge to support these students? And sometimes on our emotional availability to these students as well. And I want to get into that in just a little bit. All right, so enough of me talking. I want you now to take a moment to discuss with your colleagues what experiences have you had working with linguistically diverse students. And these could be, just to make sure we're all sort of thinking of the same people, I already mentioned this could be international students, but this could also be people like myself who are naturalized immigrants, right, who've come to this country, they spoke another language, and then they learned English as the second language, or sometimes third language, depending on where you're coming from. And then also, there are individuals who are born here, but who live in foreign-speaking communities. So, in some instances, somebody who is a U.S. citizen and was born here grew up in a household that spoke a different language and in a community that spoke a different language. And depending on a community, they maybe didn't start speaking English until they went to kindergarten, right? So these individuals will identify their primary language as being something other than English. And a lot of times their primary language is still a preferred language from them, and the language that they really do most of their sort of conceptual work inside their head in. So If you've had experience with these students, or maybe it doesn't have to be in your current job, maybe in your previous jobs, or like me, in your graduate training, what supports were available? What are you aware of? Or maybe this is something that's not available to you now, but like I said, was available to you in the past. Or maybe this is something you've bridged from your previous career or from other experiences you've had. And so I want us to think about both the systemic, the university or program level, and also individually. What makes you an effective mentor or an effective faculty, or just an effective colleague, supportive colleague to non-native English-speaking students who are eventually becoming our peers and our colleagues. So I want to bring this back to the larger group now and see if any of you would be willing to share. I think, unfortunately, as not surprising, but unfortunate that many groups discussed shortcomings and lack of resources more so than great resources. But let's open all of that up, right? Let's talk about where we have some shortcomings, and also what are some things that we're doing well. What are some things that you're thinking about that might be some welcome changes? Does anybody want to share? And I'm going to ask you to speak into the microphone because that way your comments will be also recorded and heard.
There's so much more that we could do, but a few things that I thought of were housing. We have some limited apartments for students, and a couple of our international students, one of whom is a single parent. There's no way that she could have done a graduate program without housing, and we're in Seattle, so it's really expensive. So that's one resource. We also have a great writing center that students take advantage of. And then I also talked about spending probably way too much time, but a lot of time providing writing support for my students. And I use track changes in Word, and I do that for everyone, but particularly our international students really benefit from that.
Yeah, that's great. And definitely writing is a big issue. And it's also, some of the other folks mentioned it's a huge draw on our time, right? So I think the other thing to reflect on is, so at the program level, for faculty who are willing to provide that type of support and that type of writing help, how can we maybe structure workload, or how can we incorporate that into faculty evaluation that can support, then faculty promotion? Because if you're spending a lot of time, giving very specific language-related feedback to a student's dissertation, maybe this is time you could be spending publishing your own research or, engaging in some other type of service, right? So we have professional demands as well. So, this could be something that we also consider as we consider our own programs and our own responsibilities. Yeah, thank you. Any other thoughts or comments? Well, okay. Then actually I'll tell you a little bit about what we've seen from our research, and I'll also bring in, some of my own experience in this as well. So our research specifically looks at experiences of students in clinical doctoral programs, so relevant for the work that we're doing. And of course, language comes up as the number one issue, and it's something that permeates really all aspects of the work: academic work, clinical work. And I've heard this discussed in some of the groups that, and also, has been my experience. Sometimes you speak really well, and people make assumptions that surely that means that you're a strong writer, no problem, right? But speaking well and writing well, totally different things, especially if your native language grammar structure is very different. And so sometimes, I know in my own experience, I don't mind sharing, in graduate school, there was an assumption by faculty that I wasn't putting forth a lot of effort on my papers because, certain issues around like lack of active voice or conciseness, people just thought it was, I wasn't editing them or I wasn't proofreading them. But it was a learning process for me. I did well in undergrad, but I didn't have a writing specific course. I took your basic English required courses. I did well enough on papers. But when I got to graduate school and the expectation was higher, and the expectation was that I would write, scientifically, and that it would be high quality scientific writing that I could potentially submit for publication, all of a sudden there were some shortcomings that weren't attributed to my background or experience, but instead were attributed to something else, like effort and my sort of quality of my work, right? So that's my experience, but some of the nuances that we heard from our research results was that sometimes also just aside from writing, students have a difficult time participating in class, not because they don't want to participate, but because they're having to spend time really sort of translating what is happening, then translating their own thoughts into English and, thinking about how to formulate the comment that would make. And by the time they're done doing all of that, the discussion has moved on. Or their native English-speaking peers have already said all of those things, and now they didn't get a voice. And then the student is perceived as potentially disengaged or not being able to keep up, right? Maybe not understanding certain things, or God forbid, not motivated to participate, right? Experiencing these difficulties can also result in students feeling anxious, feeling like they're, not worthy. They're sort of the imposter syndrome is a lot stronger. And then, even students who, they have the personality where they're driven and, they let these kinds of things roll off and, they're going to keep working. I had a student, for example, who use the writing center support that we had, and so she would get her papers done 2 weeks before the due date, send it to the writing center, get feedback from them, send me a draft. I would take a quick glance at it, incorporate my comments, and then submit her papers by the due date. But that means that she had so many more demands to balance. I mean, she was so busy. She was working so hard. And it was going unseen because she was performing at the expected level. So there was very little encouragement that she was getting for doing all of that hard work. And in fact, in some instances, she had to keep negotiating with her faculty, like, can I have an extension on this because I'm working on draft number 3 to get this paper, to a level where you expect it to be. And so she was having to do a lot of extra legwork and a lot of extra communication and advocating for herself. And then, we all... I think every group mentioned dissertation at some point, right? So that's kind of the biggie because it's long, it's involved, it takes a lot of our time to read it. If there's lack of clarity, sometimes it's a difficult judgment to make. Did the student not understand the research literature, or is this a lack of clarity in writing? And then how much time we have to really sift through all of that, right? Again, impacts how we might be working with that student and how we might be feeling about being part of that dissertation. Clinical work, lots of language-related issues as well, right? Clients have biases against clinicians with accents, and they wonder if they're being understood. Clinicians in training are anxious and wondering, are they understanding the clients properly? Are they able to build rapport? Again, sometimes it takes time to respond, and they have to think a little bit more about a certain type of feedback. Sometimes they, in the session, and plus, they're also anxious and are still developing their clinical skills, right? Aside from the basic level of competence and anxiety that all our students experience when they're starting clinical work, right? So in some instances, the students maybe didn't make the right call in the session because they're struggling with all of that, and they didn't quite, get that nuanced feedback to the client that they wanted to. And then the supervisor says, well, that's okay, you can bring that into the next session, but now they're even more anxious because now in the next session they have to go back to the previous session and revisit that same issue and really, manage the client's emotions and attitudes around this. And, they're being evaluated relative to their native speaking peers, right? So again, they're also worried about what is the perception then of the supervisor. Is the supervisor having to work harder with me? Am I being evaluated more negatively because of all of this? And then actually some additional nuance, just if you don't have a lot of language difficulty and you don't have a strong accent, you're white appearing, you don't experience a lot of biases and discrimination in your clinical work, there's still a lot of important cultural differences. So, my experience is, for a long time I didn't know anything about American sports because I didn't care, and, this isn't critical to my life here. But then I would go into clinical settings and people would be so passionate about a particular game that was happening, and I would be like, are they talking about football or baseball or something else that I didn't even know, and God forbid I asked that, because all of a sudden rapport was gone, and I was seen as now clinically and otherwise incompetent as an individual if I let on that I don't actually know the difference between the two, and right, so, or referee versus umpire, right, seems like minor but gives away your lack of knowledge about these kinds of things, right? So some of these kinds of issues, can come into play as well. And, in our research, students did report, a number of sort of unique cultural experiences. Unfortunately, students did report, and faculty working with the students report that students do experience some incorrect stereotyping and assumptions based on their cultural or language background. And, this kind of one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work and, can really make students feel like they're not supported in their programs. A lot of times, again, these cultural differences maybe aren't as obvious, but one example just from recent past, we had Hurricane Maria come through recently, and some of our students from Puerto Rico are maybe great English speakers, and typically we think of them as having family who are U.S. citizens who are not that far away. They're able to visit them, right? But all of a sudden, now they have a lot of emotional burden. They have a lot of concerns. They maybe having difficulty concentrating. They're thinking about events in their home country. And that's just one event I'm drawing on that's close to home. But, for other international students who are maybe further away, whose country struggles maybe aren't as publicized, in the news, maybe having these experiences that they feel like nobody really knows about and nobody understands and nobody can support them in. They do, a lot of times, the linguistically diverse students experience lack of social support from their peers as well. So this isn't just from faculty, especially in places where they are underrepresented minority and, they feel like they, aren't making friends with their American white peers as easily as they would with other foreign students. This is a little bit better, again, for larger universities that have international student organizations. A lot of students report that they're able to find a nice sort of diverse community of students who are going through some of the same things through those organizations, and then some international students can come with their families and have a little bit of support that way, but that's not true for everybody. And then, just at a personal level, again, so sometimes faculty who have a colorblind attitude can actually be perceived as not supportive by the students because, the students want to talk about their unique experiences and the faculty kind of seem disinterested or something that's being overlooked in some of those interactions. Many of you brought up lack of academic and infrastructure support. So not everybody has a writing center that they can refer their students to. Some writing centers are there but are lacking. In our program, we had a writing center that was staffed by a doctoral level person and some work study students, but now they went to an online modality that nobody knows about and is difficult to contact and is really geared towards undergraduates rather than graduate students. And so, it's questionable how supportive that really is right now. And we try to offer maybe some other mentorship, but again, with some of the things we talked about, that faculty time and availability, can also be an issue. And then, smaller schools don't have student organizations, don't have great representation of those students, right? So supports vary greatly across the board. And then for international students and some foreign-born students, there may be some financial or legal difficulties. You may have some DACA students who have issues around documentation. International students may have a visa to study but may not have a work visa. So when it comes to securing an internship or a postdoc, they may need some assistance to help navigate those experiences because there may be some restrictions around pay or number of hours that they're allowed to work. Um, Other types of things, travel home. If you live really far away and you have an 18-hour flight, going home for a week-long spring break can become cost and time prohibitive, right? So support around, not being able to go home for holidays, or maybe needing additional time if you're planning a visit to your home country. And then, unfortunately, also some students and faculty reported some experiences around microaggressions, not something overt, or we haven't had a lot of reports of overt things, but sort of things that are some of the things that we already touched on, like making assumptions about students' abilities based on their accents or on their backgrounds, or certain types of stereotypes. Sometimes class discussions can go poorly, and a student could be put on the spot around being a representative for their group, and some other students could say some things that are hurtful or inaccurate, and the faculty doesn't step in to correct that and to sort of support that student in that discussion. So sometimes the student experience, can be quite negative in that vein as well. So, but not to end it on a dark note, we also asked in our research, what recommendations do you have? What have you done that works for you? And as we've been analyzing this data, we sort of organize this in, there's different ways that we can offer support. I'm just actually going to start with peers here. I put that on because we often think of students should be supportive of other students, but I also want to, I'm a relatively junior faculty, right? Our students become our peers in very, very short future, right? So we need to be able to walk that line around having a professional distance if we need it for education and training, but also seeing them as colleagues, seeing these students as somebody that we can actually provide peer support as well and treat them with respect and understanding. But some of you already mentioned, as mentors and teachers, things that we can do effectively, try to allocate more time to these students. Now, again, sometimes that's easier said than done. But another comment I heard is, and that's come up throughout in our research, is being more proactive about reaching out to these students. As faculty and as administrators, sometimes we kind of say, well, of course I'll support you, you just need to come and tell me what you need, right? Or in our syllabi, we said, if you need accommodations, if you need something, please come and ask. And over we hear from students, I can't do that. My culture prohibits me from saying this. Or I worry that if I come and I say this, I'm going to be seen as weak. Or I don't want to already infringe on this faculty who seems to be working so hard and is already supporting so many students. Why am I going to be asking for many hours of your time when you're clearly already giving so much of yourself to our education, right? So these perspectives sometimes are accurate, sometimes are less accurate, but we need to overcome that. We need to be much more proactive. We need to reach out to the students and say, what can I do for you? And I've done that in my classes, and it's been very effective. I always say, if you need me to look over a draft, please do. But I've also approached individual students and said, please send me your draft. I have time, if you finish this draft, or if you don't have time to finish the draft ahead of time, I'll give you an extension, send me your draft, you can turn in the final paper a week later once I have a chance to provide you feedback, right? And it's done in a supportive way, not in a, I know you need help person, but, finding a good rapport and a supportive way to approach the student around this. And, we're about to break out into the next round of discussion. I also want us to think about what we can do about classroom policies, right, around this. Because, a lot of times language like, my deadlines are non-negotiable, right, actually kind of sets the precedent to those students that there's nothing that they can do. They either conform or they're out of luck. But then also, I also, and some of you brought up some great ideas around how can we do this at a more systemic and a program level, encourage our programs to have different types of discussions and diversity training initiatives. I know you're all here because you care about this issue and you're all interested in talking about this, but I'm sure we also all have colleagues who, maybe think that this is less important, right? How do we bring everybody into this conversation, and how do we get everybody to care about the experiences of these students? Sometimes it's really just, giving this kind of space for people to talk about this. a challenge that I think many of us face, and is I know for me is an ongoing learning experience, is how do I speak out against microaggressions when they happen? Sometimes it's very difficult to recognize that they're happening and intervene right then, and then knowing what to say and knowing how much to give time and space to that when it's happening in a classroom, when it's happening in a hallway, when it's happening at a student organization meeting or some other event, you know, outside of the classroom. So I think all of us can continue to work and educate ourselves about best ways to do that, because when you intervene in the moment, it's seen as very supportive, and you instantly become an ally to those students who are, you know, kind of experiencing the bias around that. Advocating for additional resources when we can. And then I also want us to think, as educators, what are some additional learning opportunities that we can provide for the students? And how can we provide the space for students to process difficult experiences? Just like faculty working with minority students, a lot of times linguistically diverse students come to linguistically diverse faculty. So if you're in a program where you have, for example, you know, our largest minority is Latinx community in the U.S., so if you're a faculty who is a native Spanish speaker, you're going to get a lot of the Spanish-speaking students. You know, in our program, we don't have any Russian-speaking students, but I get some other linguistically diverse students, you know, coming to me to process some of their difficult experiences. So how do we take the burden off of those faculty? How do we make ourselves more available for those students so that it doesn't all fall on those faculty to provide the space and to provide additional opportunities? So I summarized all of that into my discussion questions. So let's see how much time we have here. So we don't have a lot of time, I think, for small groups, so let's discuss this as a large group. So I want to hear from you about what other ideas are you having, you know, as you're listening to this, or as you, you know, talked about this in your small groups. Or maybe some other things that I didn't mention that you're thinking about. I'll go here.
I like the idea of giving some support to faculty that are working with students and giving them a little bit more time, and then having maybe those faculty have that time cut out of their schedule and the system supporting them, because I think a lot of times it is that thing where it might take longer and then you already have your own workload. And so, you know, if the system also supported faculty to work with students and give them support and time out of their own schedule, then that might be a resource and be more effective for the students.
And I just want to say that some faculty get really creative and they say, okay, I'm going to have a research project around this, you know, and so now I'm giving support, but it's also my research team, and the students and I are, you know, working on researching some sort of topic that's unique to their culture. But of course, that's not for all of us. So I agree. I think we need to address that at a more program level and system level as well.
I liked your spelling out about faculty reaching out to students, but we struggle with this as a program. I think the reasons you gave are excellent, and we talk about those, more liberal course policies, but we run up against also professional socialization and trying to find a balance between, you are a doctoral student, you're going to be entering the profession, you have an issue, and you run away from it. What's this going to happen? You know, clinical setting, you're not going to show up for a patient because you're not sure what to do. I mean, you know, managing these uncertainties. And so we've been trying to think about what's the middle line between faculty reaching out and being encouraging, and yet at what point is that not fostering readying someone to be a professional in the field?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I'm sure other people struggle with that. Does anybody have any other thoughts about that?
I think we try to approach that from a developmental perspective and really think about, and you know, if there's a student who needs us to reach out to them to help them move along, that's early on, great. But then part of the discussion and the mentoring is, okay, now what do you take from this so you move forward in a more productive way, and then you look for change. And we've had students who've been successful with that and students who have not. And then you handle that accordingly. But developmentally, I try to approach it that way.
Yeah, great point. Thank you. Any other thoughts or any other ideas?
More of a comment versus a thought or idea, but on your second bullet point there, modifying the course policies, assignments, guidelines, how do you do that in an equitable fashion? so that all students could benefit from it if they need it. But still, at the same time, I find myself struggling with the balance of providing support but not wanting to isolate other students.
Yeah, that's a great comment, and I really appreciate it. And I want us to get into some of the details, so thank you for bringing that up. So one of the things that we discussed is how important is language and grammar as part of course grade? Can you set out a rubric where the course grade is based on things other than language, but then you have other ways to work with a student around grammar and language, right? Because I think a lot of times we tie language, grammar, and clarity, and then we say, oh, lack of clarity, you're losing points, right? But perhaps there's a way that we can think of disassociating those and, having students achieve the competency and perform in a way that we want them to, and then not grading the language, not grading the grammar in the same way. And maybe also tying in the developmental perspective, or maybe this is more in early classes in the first couple of years, but then we change that expectation later on to be able to catch some development. Because certainly we would expect that issues like grammar would improve with support and experiences. So that's one idea. Another point I mentioned just about flexibility and deadlines for students who are seeking additional support, I think is very important. And, I think that is directly in our policies, right, about late assignments and docking points for late assignments, right? But I think we need to maybe be more explicit around it's a late assignment if you didn't contact me and you didn't submit anything, but if you are seeking additional writing support, and then do you ask for documentation around that, right? Because sometimes people are very strict around well, if you're seeking writing support, then you need to tell me, and I need to hear from the editor to get some verification around that. But is that prohibitive? Are some people going to say, I'm not going to provide all of that, and I'm just not going to seek writing support, right? So how do we communicate our willingness to extend those deadlines to students? Does anybody have any other thoughts or anything that you've done maybe around this?
So speaking about writing again, it's something that we think about so much because it's such a hard thing to teach and support. Thinking about what you were saying about the developmental perspective and deadlines as well, what I've done is I allow multiple drafts and I give lots of feedback and expect students, and this is for all students, expect them to incorporate that. And they do, for the most part. But I grade on their growth rather than on an absolute kind of criteria with respect to the writing and grammar and so on. So I'm looking for growth, and that's what I grade on. And I do build in multiple drafts.
Your point about class policies, that's a good one because I don't really know the answer to that, but I do know that for myself, I can't grade all the papers simultaneously, so someone has to be last, and that'll probably be 3 to 4 to 5 days after the deadline. So, I mean, I don't mind if someone, if like 1 or 2 people turn things in late, that doesn't really bother my flow of grading. But on the other hand, I don't really want everyone to know that or do that. So what I try to do is just to encourage students to talk to faculty when they need an extension, and I usually tell them, I know we seem tough, but we're actually probably more flexible than you think, especially when we hear what's going on. And so you have to use your own discretion about sharing things with us, but it is important to let us know, give us a context, and I think we're usually more sympathetic and will accommodate you more than you might think. But I think our initial stance is to be tough on deadlines and scare them so they do turn it in, but I think most of us will accept a later paper, I would say.
Yeah, great. And actually, I don't have all the answers, and I teach research methods. I'm teaching research methods right now, and I love multiple choice tests, and they're tough linguistically. A lot of times you really have to pay attention to the nuance of the question, and the possible options. But on the one hand, it's objective knowledge that I want the students to be able to answer correctly. On the other hand, I know that the students who are struggling most with those tend to be the students who are struggling with other aspects of writing, and language. So sometimes I actually have like a multiple choice question tutorial as part of my exam review, where I not just review sample questions, but I really get into here's how you evaluate like this bit and this bit, and both have to be true in order for this to be true. And, we really walk through several examples and break that down. But that also only goes so far. So, I've learned to balance my assignments so I don't just rely on multiple choice tests, but I provide, other papers and open response options. The bit where I struggle is the students love open response options, but sometimes I can't gauge the clarity of understanding from those as well, right? So we need more performance-based measures. So, I have them develop research projects and, grade different types of discussion activities and really try to diversify my learning approach there so that, students who maybe are struggling with some multiple choice exams and some other writing assignments can shine, in other ways and can get the points that they need. But I tell you, it's an iterative process. I modify something every semester when I teach that, to try to kind of address some of the issues that I see.
I apologize for coming in late, and if you've already discussed this point, just tell me, and we could talk later. I'm curious if you've talked at all about the impact of accent on test administration and validity.
No.
Okay. I ask that because we've thought about that a lot with students when the pronunciation might not be clear to the person taking the test. But it's not a situation of accommodation where there's a specific disability and that you can really document how you're going to accommodate that student. We've just really struggled with how do you support the student but prioritize valid testing for the client. So I don't know if people have thoughts about that.
No, that's great. And we've talked about sort of just accent and clinical work in general, but that's a great point. And I actually did have an experience like that, not in graduate school, but in undergrad. I took a graduate level course in assessment, and there were a couple of things that I really struggled to pronounce correctly. At the undergrad level, the expectation was very low, and I think they just kind of let me work around that. But I wonder, for folks who teach assessment or who supervise in this, what have your experiences been around this? Or if anybody has any other feedback around that.
So this kind of anecdote is actually from a colleague who had an accent when she was in graduate school. But her program actually had her they paid for or subsidized an accent coach that she worked with so that it could soften with some of the administrative stuff that she was doing. But, she actually didn't feel really good about having to go through that experience.
Right. Yeah.
I can say that part of what our struggle was the receptivity, the delivery of the suggestion, and the terminology. And this has been fascinating to hear how people describe this activity to help with pronunciation, to be more clear. And this situation, the professor called it accent reduction therapy. Woo! Yeah, that did not sound good, and that was not received well. And but that seems to be a common term out there for describing this service to assist with pronunciation. And so I'm just wondering, how do we move our field forward where we can balance both of these things? And I put out a call for information from people. I might have sent it to NCSPP, who knows, but to other things. Got very little information back from people about how they're handling this. It's just new territory. So I've just been, this has been on my mind a lot.
No, that's a great point. And maybe this is an area where we as a field really need to focus. A lot of times, actually, from our research, the trainees say, "Oh, but I'm actually encouraged by my supervisor to administer these measures in my native language, and this is where the need is, and then this is going to be kind of the focus of my training." But you're right. The flip side is, if you're good at assessment, you're probably good at assessment in different languages, but the accents certainly can be a barrier to some types of assessments. Great points. Any other thoughts or any other thoughts about what we can do to disrupt the status quo, what we can do differently, or what are some other sort of ways that uncharted territory maybe that we need to consider going into? Or
one thing we started to talk about was, certainly our approach to dissertation is arcane. It comes out of a very patriarchal history, so we began to talk about what one might be able to do to break that down, which goes beyond linguistic diversity. We didn't come up with any ideas except to allow some students to write in their native language, and that brought up complications of who will read it and evaluate it. But that was one area we thought that might be important to explore.
And to add to that, we also discussed a little bit about how to even think of that scholarship process as a way to broaden it. Like, what are other projects or other ways in which it will still display the same notion that you've met this standard, but it allows to be a project, something that's useful and beneficial in producing scholarship, and not just, this dissertation that may or may not be published, and they may just kind of chuck it and go from there like I did this thing, but how to think about it more creatively. Especially given some of our students maybe going back to other contexts where they need something that's beneficial and that they can implement.
Yeah, absolutely. In the sort of archaic ways, we think of like scholarly contribution that's written, right? But who knows who's going to read that? And maybe something that's more like a service project, or some sort of programming or something like that, that does not have to be described in a lengthy, scientifically written dissertation, but it can be described more in like a manual. Could also be acceptable, and we can think about how to set up our policies and evaluation procedures to accommodate that. I think these are really great points.
Thank you. I love that idea. Yeah, opening up the project options so instead of just original research, maybe also program evaluation or development of a treatment or intervention. I think that's a great idea. The other thing that I was thinking of was to help with maybe institutional commitment and allocation of resources to incorporate inclusion of international students as part of our mission, part of our diversity mission. I think the more that we can identify that this is an objective that will help us meet our program goals, that it's really part of our mission, I think it'll be more likely to acquire the resources that we need for our students.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I also want to mention, just at a very basic level, having department discussions around this, right? Again, sort of bringing it back to where we aren't individual warriors, or kind of having like, I had this experience, now I'm going to think about ways to address this and maybe consult with somebody, but tackling it at the department, at the program level. And, once we get good at talking about this at the department level, bringing it, to a larger, more institutional level, because I think I love that I thank you all for coming, and I think, we all have some really great ideas here, but I know we all have colleagues that don't follow those same ideas, or don't think that they're as important, or tend to overlook these kinds of things, right? So I think, but a lot of times they would be receptive if they were brought in. Or sometimes, again, we are approached by these students, but our colleagues might not be, right? So being mindful of that and sharing these experiences more broadly to make everybody aware, and encourage our colleagues to be allies and better mentors and more supportive. And then that will also help then negotiate policy change, right? And make people more receptive and come up with some other ideas maybe. Any sort of final thoughts?
So when you were talking about how those who are linguistically diverse typically seek out faculty members that can support or help them around that, I wonder if there's a way to even begin talking to, and I'm a program chair at my program, but a way to begin to think about faculty load in terms of giving them units or release or some way knowing that they are going to pay that contribution to our system. So how do we account for that? And if people have done that, I would love to talk to you afterwards to talk about how you've done that strategically. But I think that that's something that could really be beneficial and display that we're really committed to this. We're not just saying we're committed, but we're putting resource behind it.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And like I said, the best examples I've seen is faculty being creative around like using this as a research project, and because the students are concerned about this and the faculty, and then they can align this, and now it's productive and it has measurable publication or presentation or other outcomes, and the students are benefiting. And actually, one of my international students is working on this research project with me, and it's part of her dissertation. So I've done that a little bit as well. But I think we need to think of some other ways to do that that isn't just focused on research, but is more focused on mentorship and maybe support of student organizations or other different ways. And actually, we do have that where certain faculty will support those types of student organizations based on their language or other cultural identities. Okay, so I think we're coming to the end here. So now is time for the post-workshop self-assessment. So I have the same 4 questions that we started with. So now that we've had this really great discussion and reflection, take a moment to think about now, how familiar are you with unique experiences of non-native English-speaking students? Second question, how deliberate are you in designing your class policies to promote success of non-native English-speaking students? And maybe this is you're planning to be more deliberate, or maybe you actually realized that there were some things that you were doing that you weren't really thinking about before, or you kind of were taking for granted, but in fact have been successful or can be successful. How competent do you feel about promoting success of non-native English-speaking students in your programs? And finally, how knowledgeable are you about the impact that colorblindness and multiculturalism attitudes can have on non-native English-speaking students? And so I want to just briefly close with a few notes around why did I even do this, right? But sometimes we have great initiatives and then we think like, wow, this felt good, people came together, but for APA accreditation purposes and other programming purposes, we need data, right? And then because we're all strapped for time, we may think, well, how do I collect this data? Is there a questionnaire? I don't know, right? But I wanted to bring this up as an example to show you that ultimately we have a lot of knowledge about assessment, and Likert scales have great psychometric properties. They're very easy to develop and use. I chose a 5-point scale because, just to go back to a sample question here, it's easy to create a midpoint. But if you wanted more nuance and you wanted to add a couple of more anchors, you can go to a 7-point scale, right? Or if you're assessing something that you think is going to have a lot of variability, you can expand it and go to a 9-point scale. Right, you may need to come up with some other, a couple of more anchors, but a 9-point scale can also have just the midpoints and the extremes, and then it just gives people a little bit more variability in terms of their responses. The other thing is sometimes people struggle with, how do I develop the questions? But again, I just went and reflected on what are some key points that I want to highlight, right? And I took the language specifically from my slides, from writing of those points, and developed the questions around that. And it's a really easy way to assess attitude change, which is, we're really great at assessing didactic knowledge and skills, and many of us use different types of rubrics or other sort of performance metrics, right? But sometimes attitudes are a little bit trickier. And but at the same time, we want to report to APA and other powers, administrative powers that be, about how successful we are in training, better attitudes around multiculturalism or other certain, areas of diversity. And attitudes are different than competency, right? So competencies are a little bit more difficult to assess because they have to be a little bit more behavior specific. But having said that, attitudes also have their place. So this is kind of to showcase how you can develop some assessment of attitudes. And because I am a quantitative geek, I have to tell you that the way to then really get a great level of analysis there is to compute difference scores. So that's why I did a pre-assessment and a post-assessment. A lot of times we do a post-assessment, and we hope that everybody ends on the more competent than not side, right? But we don't know who our audience was. We don't know who came in with what knowledge. And if you do a pre-post, it's very easy. You just do the quick subtraction, and then you see you're going to have some people who have no change because they either weren't paying attention or they were great and competent and had great attitudes to begin with, right? But then you're going to have some variability. You're going to have some people who have more change, some people who have less change, and then you can average across people. Or you can also hone in on, if you didn't see a whole lot of change, what is it about this? Is it because you were preaching to the choir and everybody sort of came in and was already like-minded? Or maybe there are some elements that showed less change and other elements that showed more change, and you can really get into, kind of analyzing what you did and making changes for future programming. And of course, it's a way to systematically collect data. So the more you build into your classroom activities or other types of activities, you actually are collecting data throughout, and then you never know. You may be able to publish that data. You may be able to disseminate that data or use it somehow else. So we're then getting away from just having anecdotal experience about, I felt good, this seemed like it went well, everybody was engaged, to now I also have some measurable outcomes that I can report, or I can use these measurable outcomes to do better programming to change how I'm approaching this. Any questions or thoughts you have about this? It's kind of not really related to the core points of the talk, but I thought would be kind of an interesting point to also add. Okay, so then I want to thank you for coming today and for supporting or being interested in supporting linguistically diverse students. I haven't shared these slides with NCSBP yet, but I will, so they'll be available. And also if you want to reach out to me and get some more information or get me to send you the slides, or I also have lots of great references that I was talking about that I'll be happy to share with you. Please reach out and I'm happy to talk more. Thank you.